Before I begin this video, just to say apologies for the fact that my voice is slightly distorted. Unfortunately, it's a bit dry since the weather being what it is. I'm suffering from a light cold, very typical in London at this time of year. As I said, apologies if this causes any problems, but anyway, there it is. I'll proceed with this video, given the fact that I've got a cold, and given that in some respects there's been perhaps a little less news than usual. Maybe this video will be a little shorter than some of my others. Well, we'll see. And if so, I suspect some will receive that fact with relief. Anyway, as I start this video, I start with an article on Associated Press, which perhaps gets the sense of the nature of the war in Ukraine at this particular juncture. It began with the title, Ukraine's Winter of Discontent. Winter of Discontent being, of course, a phrase which first appeared in Shakespeare's Richard III, somebody with a sort of lyrical, literary frame of mind, using it to describe the mood amongst the troops, the Ukrainian troops in Ukraine, as they face the second winter of the war. Well, somebody at Associated Press, an editor, perhaps felt that that title was a bit too gloomy, and they changed it, and the title as it now appears is A Gloomy Mood Hangs Over Ukraine's Soldiers as War with Russia Grinds On. Well, before I begin that programme, let me say that there's been quite a lot of news actually from Ukraine today, and interestingly, the most important news, or perhaps not important news, but the most striking news, is the news that is now coming, not from the battlefront, but from Kiev itself. And that is that we got reports yesterday that General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, he has found, or his people have found, that his office, or perhaps it's not his current office, but an office he was about to move into, has been bugged, that there is a wiretap there. And apparently there's been more research and investigation by investigators working for General Zaluzhny himself, researching into these wiretaps, and more have been discovered, these bugging devices, and it seems they don't just affect General Zaluzhny himself, they affect members of his staff, members, in other words, of Ukraine's general staff. And there's lots of discussion, speculation as to who has planted these bugs, these listening devices. And interestingly, one report which I saw coming from Ukraine, from a Ukrainian source, discounted the possibility that these wiretaps were placed there by the Russians. Now, I think it is the universal belief amongst practically everyone in Ukraine at the moment that these listening devices were planted by officials, by people acting on behalf of President Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, the man who, according to some theories, actually controls Zelensky. Well, if so, further confirmation about the collapse in the relationship between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky, and the deep suspicion that President Zelensky's team holds for General Zaluzhny. Now, I think that none of this is going to come as any kind of surprise to anybody who has been following this program, this channel, for months now. For over a year, I have been speaking about the apparent tensions that exist, according to Ukrainian Telegram channels, specifically resident and legitimate, between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. I remember that General Zaluzhny was asked about tensions between him and President Zelensky in the interview he gave in September 2022 to The Economist. In that interview, he denied that there were any tensions between himself and President Zelensky. But talk of conflict continued throughout 2022, 2023, and over the last few weeks, this conflict between Zaluzhny and Zelensky has become open. And we've been seeing that the relationship between Zelensky and Zaluzhny has been visibly deteriorating. We've had the extraordinary affair, by the way, still unexplained affair, of General Zaluzhny's aide being blown up on his birthday when supposedly he pulled a pin out of a live hand grenade that was given to him as part of a present. There have been so many contradictory accounts of this particular incident that I'm not going to try and analyse or discuss it any further. Suffice to say that I think most people in Ukraine believe that this was a successful assassination. We've then had reports that General Budanov, the military intelligence chief, that his wife was poisoned with heavy metals. Again, we've heard very little more about that particular story. The last I heard was that she had been hospitalized. It seems that she's safe. Certainly General Budanov, about whom more shortly, is continuing to give interviews, and he seems to be well himself. We've had briefings by Zaluzhny and Zelensky, or not them directly, but by their teams, essentially against each other. We have seen reports about this conflict starting to appear in the Western media. And about a week ago, I remember that there was a further report which said that President Zelensky and Andrei Yermak had called together the various heads of Ukraine's intelligence and counterintelligence and internal security agencies, and that they had been instructed to prepare for a possible Maidan 3 or coup attempt. And though Zaluzhny was not identified as the arch plotter, it's not difficult to see that it was Zaluzhny who was probably the person uppermost in everybody's mind. And again, about 10 days ago, I seem to remember, General Zaluzhny supposedly refused a direct request from Zelensky's people to resign. I said that this was an astonishing act of insubordination by a subordinate commander receiving such a request from his supreme commander-in-chief in wartime, and might even be seen as a first step towards a coup. But anyway, all of that has been going on. And like I suspect everybody else following this program, I cannot help but think, in fact, I am sure that this information that General Zaluzhny is being bugged, that there are listening devices being planted in his office or offices, that his team are being monitored and surveyed as well. I don't doubt that this is all a part of this particular power struggle and is symptomatic of the crisis that is going on in Kiev. Now, I don't know how this is all going to play out in the end. I don't know whether General Zaluzhny is playing some kind of clever waiting game. Perhaps he is. Or perhaps, just possibly, he doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't want to resign. He wants to remain in place. But he doesn't really have any actual plans to carry out a coup, because he knows that the Western powers would not approve, and he knows how dangerous a coup in this particular situation would be. So I don't know what General Zaluzhny's motivations are. That President Zelensky wants to sack General Zaluzhny, of that I have no doubt at all, but clearly he's finding it very difficult. There are at least some military commanders, and perhaps many more soldiers, who would be extremely unhappy indeed if the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine in wartime was sacked in that particular way. What I can say is that the longer this situation continues in the way that it is, with Zaluzhny and Zelensky squaring off against each other, the greater the risk that when the crisis eventually boils over, as it inevitably must, that it will spiral out of control, and also the more debilitating for the decision-making process in Ukraine it is going to be, with General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky now weighing every decision that they make about the war and about every other matter in the context and according to the frame of their own internal power struggle. Now, it may not be coincidence that after information about the discovery of these listening devices was disclosed, and by the way, this information must have been disclosed at the instigation of General Zaluzhny himself. Anyway, directly after that, we had a video clip of General Zaluzhny appearing to answer questions. Now, I say answering questions because, of course, he barely did answer any questions, but the question was put to him: is the situation on the front lines critical? And he said no, one syllable answer. And then he was asked again whether Ukraine has any plans to go on the offensive, and he said that he wasn't prepared to reply to that during wartime, which is news because, of course, last year when Ukraine did start to plan its great summer offensive, spring-summer offensive, to break through to the Sea of Azov in Zaporozhye region, as I remember, there was no secret about it at all. There was endless discussions, programs, articles about this. Western officials openly talked about it. Government officials openly talked about it. There was no end of commentary and discussion. And the same had been true just a few months earlier, in the summer of 2022, in advance of Ukraine's Kherson counteroffensive. Suddenly, General Zaluzhny has discovered the importance of secrecy in war. But anyway, it was a most odd exchange. Its purpose, so far as I can see, was more to remind people of General Zaluzhny's existence and the fact that he's still there, than to actually provide any real answers about the actual situation on the battle lines. And one thing we have heard since is General Zaluzhny apparently saying that the decision by President Zelensky in the summer to sack all the military commissars in charge of the mobilization of recruiting, or rather conscripting, Ukrainian men into the army. This was a serious mistake. It was a serious mistake on President Zelensky's part to sack all these people. They were professionals. The people who replaced them are not professionals. Sacking all those military commissars last summer has actually weakened and disorganized the conscription process, which might, by the way, be true, but there it is. Now, General Zaluzhny said all of that just a few hours, so I understand, though I'm not sure whether Zaluzhny said this in private or whether he said it in public, but most probably he said it in private. But anyway, he's supposed to have said this just a few hours before Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief, participated in a talk show on Ukrainian television. And Budanov discussed the situation with the mobilization of men in Ukraine. He made some really startling points. He said, first of all, that the Ukrainian armed forces now number 1.1 million men altogether. He said that it is impossible to keep these forces up to strength, relying exclusively on voluntary recruitment. He said that the result is that conscription has to take place, but then he went on to say that all the best men had joined up voluntarily in the first 6 months of the war, and that those who are joining up now, or who are being conscripted now, are unwilling, and that their combat capability is practically zero. That's what he said. So that doesn't sound at all promising. And though Ukraine does appear to be in the throes of some kind of piecemeal conscription drive, perhaps it's worth pointing out that we've not had that big declaration of a general mobilization that was being talked about just a few weeks ago. We've not heard any announcement, for example, that all the students and young people studying in the schools and universities in Kiev and other places were being called up en masse, as demanded by people like, for example, the former British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. We haven't heard anything like that. We've seen again arrangements made to call up women. It's easier for the draft offices to do that. But again, there's been no generic announcement of a further mobilization, of a mass mobilization of women. So the conclusion one has come to is that a stealth mobilization is taking place. The Ukrainian, the new commissars appointed by Zelensky in the summer are indeed busy trying to fill the gaps in the Ukrainian armed forces, rounding up everybody they can, wherever they can. And some pretty extraordinary pictures about this have now appeared in the media, and I'm referring now to the Western media. But we're now hearing that both General Zaluzhny and Kirill Budanov are dissatisfied with the process. Zaluzhny is saying that the really good commissars who are in charge of conscription have all been sacked, and that those who have replaced them are not up to their job. And Budanov is saying that the people who are being conscripted now are pretty much useless and have no real value. They don't add anything of real value to the Ukrainian army because they're not really willing to sign up and fight. So, again, I can't help but think that these comments from Zaluzhny and from Budanov, and by the way, I don't have any idea whose side Budanov is taking in this power struggle. But anyway, I don't have any doubt that these concerted comments about the chaotic nature of Ukraine's current mobilization the fact that it is not working out as planned. These coordinated comments from Zaluzhny and Budanov are again intended to criticize Zelensky. And given that it appears that it was some people in the West, Ben Wallace, and people in the United States, who came up with this idea of some kind of bigger mobilization drive in Ukraine, I can't help but think that these comments by Zaluzhny and Budanov are as much addressed to the West as they are to people in Ukraine. They are telling people in the West, look, not only does Zelensky mismanage the military decision-making, the actual conduct of operations on the front lines, but he is also failing in that most basic duty, which as a civilian president he ought to be executing, which is that of conscripting men for the Ukrainian armed forces. Whether anyone else would do it better is, of course, another matter. And that brings me back to the article at Associated Press, the one which was originally titled Ukraine's Winter of Discontent, but which is now telling us that the Ukrainian soldiers are gloomy as the war with Russia grinds on. And I suspect that this article has been edited and re-edited and shifted around, and the language has been toned down in various places. But though it works incredibly hard to try to give a positive spin on Ukraine's war effort, it does admit that the Ukrainian soldiers, the frontline soldiers, are becoming increasingly dispirited. It says that despite a disappointing counteroffensive this summer, again, let me reiterate a point which I have made many times, that the counteroffensive this summer was not disappointing. It didn't just fail. It was comprehensively defeated by the Russians. So long as this evasion as to what actually happened this summer is continued, all Western understanding and reporting and decision-making about this war will continue to be heavily distorted. But anyway, AP continues to talk about the disappointing counteroffensive of the summer and signs of wavering financial support from allies. Ukrainian soldiers say they remain fiercely determined to win. Again, no attempt anywhere in this article to explain what victory for Ukraine actually means, but never mind. The article then goes on to say, as winter approaches, most people would say that in December, with snowstorms all over Ukraine now, with much of the Ukrainian battlefield snow-covered, as becomes immediately obvious if you follow the videos, winter is not only approaching, but is actually here. But anyway, as winter approaches, they worry that Russia is better equipped for battle and are frustrated about being on the defensive again in a grueling war. Some doubt the judgment of their leaders. And the article goes on to say discontent among Ukrainian soldiers, once extremely rare and expressed only in public, is now more common and out in the open. And then we have comments from soldiers, various soldiers, who complain about bad or incomprehensible decisions. We've had a soldier called Boxer. Notice that he may be speaking openly, but he continues to use these anonymizing pseudonyms, talking about the Krinky battle. He says that he doesn't understand why it was launched now in the autumn and winter and not months ago during the warmer weather. I don't understand. Now it's harder and colder. It's not just my feeling. Many units share it. And we have other soldiers again complaining about the fact that things are not going especially well this winter. So, all of these soldiers now speaking increasingly openly, increasingly discontented, complaining about the state of the war. I can't help but wonder again whether the fact that we're hearing these comments of disaffection from the military, from soldiers, from battlefront soldiers, isn't also partly a reflection of the ongoing power struggle in Kiev. I'm not suggesting for one moment that this discontent within the Ukrainian army doesn't actually exist. But given that General Zaluzhny is so much at odds with Ukraine's political leadership, with President Zelensky, and with his decisions, and given that General Zaluzhny has been positioning himself for so long as the supposed voice of reason within the Ukrainian political military leadership, whose wise advice, allegedly, has been disregarded by President Zelensky, who orders irrational counteroffensives and makes eccentric decisions and disastrous decisions to defend every millimetre of ground. Could it be that General Zaluzhny has quietly given the green light to his subordinates to allow soldiers to speak out for the first time, as they're now increasingly doing, to more and more of the Western media as part of his campaign to undermine President Zelensky? Well, I don't know this for a fact, but perhaps that is what is happening. As I said, power struggles, when they take place, tend to be all-consuming things. And whilst I can't imagine that allowing all this discontent to bubble to the surface actually does help Ukraine's war effort, or at least in any objective way, if it's been quietly encouraged in order to undermine Zelensky, it wouldn't surprise me. I have to say that there are some very strange comments in this AP article. We have a soldier called Sergei who says that, saying that if we don't have a single bullet, we will kill them with shovels. Sure, everyone is tired of war, physically and mentally, but imagine if we stop, what happens next? I seem to remember that it was a couple of months ago that the British Ministry of Defence was telling us that the Russian army was reduced to fighting the war with shovels. And here we have a Ukrainian soldier telling us, well, actually, it might be us in Ukraine who are reduced to fighting with shovels. But if that's what comes, so be it. We will go on fighting nonetheless. But anyway, putting things like that aside, one of the things that makes me think that perhaps some of this discontent that we're hearing about, the fact that the soldiers are being allowed or are able to speak out in the way that they are, is being actually encouraged by General Zaluzhny and his team, is the fact that we are we see in the same article by Associated Press, it suddenly and rather abruptly shifts from discussing the situation on the front lines, the comments that the soldiers on the front line are making about the situation on the front lines. It pivots suddenly to talk about the situation in Kiev and about the power struggle between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. The fatigue and frustration on the battlefield are mirrored in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, where disagreements among leaders have recently spilled out into the open. President Zelensky last month publicly disputed the assessment by Ukraine's military chief, Valery Zaluzhny, that the war had reached a stalemate. And the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has repeatedly lashed out at Zelensky, saying he holds too much power. Disquiet in the halls of power appears to have filtered down to the military's rank and file, who increasingly have misgivings about inefficiency and faulty decision-making within the bureaucracy they depend on to keep them well armed for the fight. And there we go. And then we have a long discussion about drones and the fact that drones have become absolutely essential in Ukraine's war effort. But we go on to learn that Ukrainian fighters complain that the military has been too slow in training drone operators. It took 7 months to obtain the paperwork needed from multiple government agencies to train 75 men, said Konstantin Denisov, a Ukrainian soldier. We wasted time for nothing, he said. Commanders elsewhere complain of not enough troops or delays in getting drones repaired, disrupting combat missions. And we then go on to read that in spite of that, Ukraine intends to go on fighting, even though the Ukrainians accept that the Russians have far more of everything, including drones, than the Ukrainians do, and that the discrepancy is growing. While Ukrainian soldiers have proved to be resourceful and innovative on the battlefield, Moscow has dramatically scaled up its defense industry in the past year, manufacturing armored vehicles and artillery rounds at a pace Ukraine cannot match. Yes, they're ahead of us in terms of supply, said Boxer. It allows the drone to go up 2,000 meters, avoid jammers, whereas Ukrainian drones can only fly 500 meters. We wait for weapons we were supposed to receive months ago. They are, and another Ukrainian officer says, called Dolphin, they're simply weakening our positions and strongholds, injuring our soldiers, thereby forcing them to leave the battlefields. I can say for my unit, we are prepared 60% because, again, there's insufficient, we are unable to restaff sufficiently. So there you go. A power struggle. AP itself tells us that the news about it is filtering all the way down to the front lines. Even commanders on the front lines are now chipping in, and they're saying things, critical things, which look to me to be principally focused against President Zelensky. It almost seems to me as if someone is working hard to try to turn the bulk of the army, or at least much of the army, against Zelensky, specifically, to blame him for the problems in lack of men, poor rotation, insufficient supply, eccentric decisions as to where and when to attack in places like Krinky, things of that sort. And once again, and I have to say this, to me, all of this looks very much like long-term preparations for some kind of a coup. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not in the next few weeks, perhaps when Avdeyevka falls, or there is some other military crisis on the battlefronts, that a decision will finally be made at that point to resolve this power struggle between Zaluzhny and Zelensky by arranging, getting more of the army to demand that President Zelensky goes. Now, what that will achieve, I have absolutely no idea. Clearly, it is now backed by more and more people. Mayor Klitschko of Kiev is joining in. I get the sense that some of the commanders, General Tarnavsky, who is the overall commander in Avdeyevka and on the southern front lines, he probably is on side with Zaluzhny over this. We see some of the soldiers also increasingly complaining. The media in Ukraine is apparently also becoming increasingly critical. Western governments make little secret of the fact that they're gradually losing patience with Zelensky. But in no case are we told what General Zaluzhny or whoever he supports as the next political leader of Ukraine is going to do to turn things round in this situation. And can I just say, there's been another outstanding article by Eve Smith on naked capitalism, and she makes what seems to me the entirely obvious and valid and completely correct point, which is that having staked everything on this summer offensive, the one that Ukraine launched in June, and which, if you believe the Western media, is still underway. I mean, the Western media not only won't accept or acknowledge that the offensive was a defeat, they still refuse to accept that it is actually over, despite confirmation from all across the battlefronts that Ukraine is now on the defensive pretty much everywhere. Anyway, once this offensive was defeated, as Eve Smith absolutely correctly says, the Western powers have no plan B. They are scrambling for one, but they can't really come up with one that is coherent and makes any sense of what to do on the battlefronts. We've had that article recently in the New York Times about how some people in the United States, some military people in the United States, perhaps General Aguto and General Cavoli, are trying to explain to the Ukrainians what you need to do is to go onto the defensive, to consolidate your positions, that you must fight the war on a much tighter budget than previously because you're not going to get as much support in 2024 as you got in 2022 and 2023, that you need to hold out, rebuild, not clear with what, but anyway, that is what you need to do. Some Ukrainian commanders apparently are pushing back. They still seem to have difficulty accepting that the United States and the West don't have infinite supplies of ammunition and machines and ATACMS missiles and all of those sorts of things. we've had a bizarre interview with General Tarnowski, which gives an extraordinary sense of the problem. This is an interview that General Tarnowski has given to Reuters. He accepts that things aren't going well. He admits that in some areas we move to defense and in some we continue our offensive actions. He also acknowledges that there's a terrible shortage of ammunition. The volumes which we have today are not sufficient for us, given our needs. So we're redistributing it. We're replanning tasks that we had set for ourselves and make them smaller because we need to provide for them. And there is a problem with ammunition, especially post-Soviet shells. And today these problems exist across the front line. And it is a very big problem. But anyway, he accepts that. But he still clings to the fantasy that the West will come to the rescue. And he's talking now, increasingly, he's staying all on the arrival of the F-16s. Ukraine increasingly needs the means to defend itself against growing strikes by Russian attack drones. But Ukraine is banking on Western F-16 fighter jets being delivered, he said. With the presence of the F-16, it will be totally different. In my opinion, as an infantry officer, the F-16 is like a Mercedes compared with a Zaporozhets. That's a small volume car, Volkswagen Beetle type car that the Soviet Union is producing. Everyone is hoping, which is, by the way, a ridiculous comparison. If we are comparing the F-16 with the fighter jets that the Russian Air Force is now equipped with, the F-16 is comprehensively outmatched by Russia's Sukhoi 35 and fifth generation Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, and by the MiG-31 fighter jets that the Russians are now increasingly deploying on the battlefronts. And it appears that they've been joined by also very advanced MiG-35 fighter jets as well. So, I mean, I don't know where General Tarnowski gets this idea that it's a Mercedes compared to an old Soviet Zaz, to give that car the Zaporozhye, it's its name. It's an absurd notion. But anyway, some Ukrainians apparently still cling to this fantasy. But anyway, coming back to the New York Times article, that's one proposed plan B. Go on to the defensive, build up fortified lines, hope that you can hold back the Russian tide, even though the AP article spoke about the deep frustration the Ukrainian soldiers feel at the fact that they've been thrown onto the defensive. And anyway, go onto the defensive and hope that the Russians will negotiate. I don't think anybody sees that actually in the long term as a viable plan B. And as I discussed in a program I did a few days ago, even articles in CNN, we have US intelligence officers acknowledging that even if Ukraine starts to do these things, and even if Ukraine continues to get the Western funding and military support that it's looking to, it might not be enough anyway to change the outcome of the war. But to get an even better sense of how utterly confused the West has now become about what to do next, another article in the Western media which makes Eve Smith's point for her. Just go to Gideon Rachman, our old friend, in the Financial Times. And he says, Ukraine and its backers need a credible path to victory. Securing and sustaining the independence of the country should be the key war aim. And the article goes on to say, Ukraine goes into the new year short of ammunition, money and diplomatic support. Underlying these critical shortages, there is another important deficiency. The country and its Western backers no longer have a convincing theory of victory. Unless they can come up with one, Western support for Ukraine will continue to waver. And he goes on to say that the counteroffensive failed. Again, avoid all use of the word defeat. And with the failure of the offensive, neither hawks nor doves saw their theory of victory. Regime change in the case of the hawks, negotiations in the course of the negotiations on the West's terms in the course of the doves put into practice. And he says that Ukrainian forces are already having to ration ammunition, where the EU and the US are struggling to agree new packages of military aid. Without new money, Ukraine's position on the battlefield could deteriorate fast. The fear must now be that while 2023 was the year of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, 2024 will be the year that Russia goes back on the attack. The worst case scenarios are that if Western aid is cut off, Ukraine could be in serious trouble by the summer. And all of that is true. And he also admits that the the US presidential election is now driving much of American opposition to renewing aid for Ukraine. But there is also genuine skepticism about Ukraine's prospects. And so we have to come up with a new theory of victory. And firstly, we have to perhaps finally accept the need for Ukraine to negotiate with the Russians, even if that includes making territorial concessions. But Gideon Rachman appears to think that that really isn't an option, because he says that Ukrainian officials can point to a litany of agreements that Putin has made and then broken. Which agreements? I mean, that is a pretty big and bold statement. Which agreements has Putin made and then broken? The Minsk agreement? The Ukrainians themselves have admitted that it was they who broke it. In fact, they had no intention of ever implementing it. So which agreements is it that Putin is supposed to have made and broken? I asked the question. Gideon Rachman, of course, doesn't provide us with any explanation of that. He says that Ukrainian officials believe that any cessation in the fighting would simply be used as an opportunity for Russia to rearm. Russia is already rearming. It doesn't need those opportunities. And then he says an alternative to a formal agreement between Russia and Ukraine might be a de facto freezing of the conflict. Ukraine would move into a mainly defensive posture and hold off further Russian advances. The fighting would never stop completely, but it would dwindle. Perpetual war, in other words, on the defensive. And he says that in an intermediate situation, somewhere between a frozen conflict and a formal peace treaty, would be an armistice. And then he conjures up again the Korean scenario. South Korea, after the armistice was secured, boomed, and that might be a possible new theory of victory, the South Korean variant. All of that discussed weeks and months ago. The Russians have already flatly rejected it. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, has now said that only surrender by Kiev will do. And why does he think, given this thinking in Moscow, that the Russians would agree to an armistice? And why does he assume, given that Ukraine is short of everything, weapons, men, that the Russians can be held off indefinitely if Ukraine goes onto the offensive? Ukraine wasn't able to break through the major Russian fortified lines in the south because Russia is so much more powerful and, to be frank, better organized than Ukraine. Expecting that Ukraine can duplicate Russia's victory of the summer seems a very tall order indeed. But that's the best that Gideon Rachman can come up with. Try to talk the Russians into some kind of a freeze of the war, an armistice. And if that doesn't work, well, try to hold them off indefinitely. Keep the war going indefinitely, even as the Russian Colossus continues to arm and improve its supplies and build up its forces and deploys more and more forces against Ukraine, and eventually, as must happen, overwhelms the Ukrainian defenses. The one thing, again, that Gideon Rachman is not willing to do is to sit down with the Russians and do the only thing that might persuade them to hold back, which is negotiate a long-term peace and security treaty between Russia and the United States and possibly NATO for Europe, which would have to be on the lines of the Russian draft treaties that the Russians prepared and proposed back in December 2021. That remains, for Gideon Rachman, unthinkable. So he comes up with these fantasy scenarios, the freeze, which the Russians have already rejected, and the indefinite defense, which I don't think anybody takes really seriously instead. So let's assume that President General Zaluzhny has his coup and he takes over, or he installs someone more to his liking, perhaps former President Poroshenko or someone like that. How does that change the situation in any way? Is General Zaluzhny prepared to talk to the Russians? I discussed yesterday in my program how unforgiving and implacable the Russians have now become. Is General Zaluzhny prepared to entertain the kind of terms that the Russians might be demanding from him? Is President Poroshenko, who signed the Minsk agreement but then sabotaged it, if he were to come back, would he be prepared to agree to these proposals, these Russian proposals? I think it most unlikely, which of course gives a particular political context to all of these political maneuvers and intrigues that are taking place in Kiev today. It really is a case, I think it was Dima in the military summary channel who described it as two spiders fighting inside a bottle. They don't seem to have much understanding of how bad the situation is becoming, or of the implacable mood that the Russians are now in. The conflict in Kiev clearly has become an all-consuming thing for both of them. I suspect that Zelensky and Zaluzhny by now loathe each other so much that this power struggle between them is now at the forefront of each of their minds. Anyway, what is going on the actual battlefields? Well, there's actually again been a fair amount of news. And I should say that we were privileged on the Duran to have to do a program with Patrick Lancaster, one of the most outstanding reporters, in my opinion, in this war. He's there on the front lines regularly. He meets the soldiers. Obviously, he is based on the Russian side of the lines, but he strives to be as objective in his accounting as possible. I stress objective. I'm not suggesting that he doesn't have his political biases, as all of us do, but he does go out of his way to try to describe things as they actually are and not allow his biases to affect the objectivity of his reporting. And the very interesting thing is that what he's telling us is essentially the same thing that we've been hearing and getting from all of these Russian telegram channels. Now, I have been repeatedly receiving all sorts of comments and complaints from various people. And this has been true for the last 2 years almost, since the current iteration of the war began with the Russian declaration of the SMO, that I'm taking too much of my information from these Russian telegram channels. But yesterday, several kind people sent me a video of a video lecture by Major Reisner of the Austrian military, who was providing us with his explanations of why the Ukrainian offensive of the summer failed. And it was a very peculiar experience, because listening to this presentation by Major Reisner, I was hearing all the same things that I've been hearing 9 months before, well, reading 9 months before, in all the Russian telegram channels, Slavyangrad first and foremost, but some others as well, Interslava, for example, reading it all there, all the things, as I say, being said months ago by reading that was there months ago in these telegram channels. Major Reisner has now finally come round to saying, and an analysis of the Russian fortifications, which seems to me, from Major Reisner, remarkably similar to a identical analysis, well, a very similar analysis, provided by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas a couple of months ago, before the Ukrainian offensive was launched. Now, Major Reisner made some really remarkable claims. At least I thought that they were remarkable. He seemed to think that if Ukraine had been given some more weapons, more ATACMS missiles, more F-16s, that kind of thing, well, it might have changed the course of the offensive. He makes, by the way, one fundamental error, which many people make, in fact, most people make. He assumes that when Ukraine began its offensive in June, it had no air force at all, and that the Ukrainian Air Force played no role in the offensive whatsoever, whilst it is true that the Russians had a much more powerful air force at all times than the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians most certainly did have an air force. They had Sukhoi 27 fighter jets and MiG-29 fighter jets, and these did in fact try to provide some degree of air cover and ground attack strikes in support of the Ukrainian troops on the ground. They were unsuccessful, but bear in mind, they were probably available in at least similar quantities to the F-16s that Ukraine is expected to receive from about August. But anyway, overall, my conclusion, listening to Major Reisner, is that I'm absolutely right. It is these telegram channels, first and foremost, Slavyangrad, that one should go to for actual reporting of the war. I think it is fair to say that in terms of factual commentary, there wasn't a single thing that Major Reisner said which was news to me. I'd already read it months ago in Slavyangrad and other places. And in fact, Major Reisner even made certain claims, for example, that the village of Verbovoye was at one point captured by Ukraine, which I can say, based on what I've been reading on these telegram channels, and which has been confirmed subsequently. Anyway, that particular claim was definitely wrong. So, anyway, there we go. So, we have a situation now being described by these telegram channels and to a great extent corroborated by Patrick Lancaster. And they tell us this, that the situation in Marinka is exactly as these telegram channels have been reporting. Marinka has been essentially captured by the Russians. The Russians are now pushing forward, advancing around the area of Marinka, working towards improving their positions around Marinka, perhaps unraveling the Ukrainian defenses in this area, and that the Russians are also steadily, incrementally completing their encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Avdeyevka, even as they push hard within Avdeyevka itself, which they have now penetrated into the residential areas, principally from the south. Still clearly much fighting to do in the Avdeyevka area, but the Russians are pushing forward in every single place and location. And here perhaps, and for once, I will again, I've done this once or twice before, slightly take issue with some of the analysis, with one piece of analysis that Dima at the Military Summary channel has done. He suggests that, sometimes the Russians push forward in Stepovoye, sometimes they push, which is to the northwest of Avdeyevka, sometimes they're pushing forward in a place called Pervomaiska, which is another small village to the south, to the southwest of Avdeyevka. He appears to think that these are somehow uncoordinated Russian advances, that when the Russians are stopped in one direction, they refocus and attack in another. I disagree. I think that all of these attacks towards Stepovoye and beyond, within Avdeyevka itself, at Pervomaiska, that these are all part of a single operational plan. But what the Russians are doing is that they're keeping up the pressure on the Ukrainians in every part of the Ukrainian perimeter around Avdeyevka. They're gradually grinding down the Ukrainian defenses around Avdeyevka, and they are working ultimately to close the sack and to capture the town of Avdeyevka itself. So where I think he sees a series of opportunistic Russian advances, to me it looks much more like working out of what I would suggest is a very flexible and constantly adapted overall plan. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. But the other place, around Bakhmut, again, we hear more news, more Russian advances around Bakhmut. I saw a report this morning that the Russians are now within 4 kilometers of Chasiv Yar. Now, I've heard similar claims before. I remember some weeks ago, months ago, I actually read all kinds of reports, which I actually referenced on videos that I did then, that the Russians were within 2 kilometers of Kupiansk. And perhaps this claim that they're 4 kilometers from Chasiv Yar is as unreliable as that claim about them being 2 kilometers from Kupiansk turned out to be. But it does seem as if the Russians are indeed pushing hard around Bakhmut, that they're gradually, steadily gaining ground. Patrick Lancaster was there. He actually saw he was with a unit that was advancing around Bakhmut. If you watch our program with him, you see what he has to say about that. And importantly, there's a report, a Ukrainian television report. Ukrainian commanders in the area are now claiming that there's as many as 80,000 Russian troops now concentrated in and around Bakhmut. Now, if that is correct, then we have perhaps 40,000 Russian troops operating around Avdeyevka, 80,000 Russian troops, which I think would be the biggest concentration of any single force in the conflict by either side up to now. In Bakhmut, apparently the Russians are now once again reinforcing, sending more troops towards Kupiansk. The Dima at the Military Summary Channel provided some video footage of drone strikes around Kupiansk near the village of Sinkovka, which appeared to confirm that the Russians, at least I understood them to confirm, that the Russians are now in control of at least a part of this particular village and have been steadily improving their positions there. And it looks as if the Russians might finally be about to break through in Sinkovka, which would, by the way, finally bring them within striking distance of Kupiansk itself. Anyway, it looks as if very substantial Russian forces are concentrating. In Avdeyevka, as I said, a complex battle of encirclement has been underway now for about 2.5 months and is gradually making progress. Even General Tarnavsky, in that interview with Reuters, appeared to concede that to some extent. And in Bakhmut, the Russians appear to be advancing heavier, more powerfully, faster as well. Khromovo has been captured. Bogdanovka is being outflanked. The Russians apparently are now consolidating their positions around Klishayevka and Kurdyumovka to the southwest, and they're pushing on towards Chasov Yar. So, again, look at the situation on the battlefronts. In terms of the war, isn't that ultimately what matters? Isn't the situation on the battle lines the single thing that tells us best where a war is going, what the direction is? Isn't it in fact the situation on the battle lines what, in the end, decides the outcome of a war? One way or the other, and you can find a lot more detailed descriptions of what's going on the battle lines than I can provide. It seems to me that the situation is now clear. The Russians are pushing forward on every part of the front line. They're doing so in growing force. The Ukrainians are short of men and equipment to hold them back. No less a person than Kirill Budanov tells us that the men who Ukraine has called up to fight are unwilling to do so and are of zero value to the Ukrainian army. There's lots of talk about creating fortified lines in various places, but very little evidence that that is actually happening. Dima at the Military Summary Channel is suggesting that there might be a Russian advance in northeastern Ukraine towards Sumy, cutting off the roads to Kharkiv. Who's to say? Maybe he's right. All of that. So, what goes on in Kiev? I don't think it really matters a great deal. I wonder even whether these financial aid packages that we're seeing being discussed at such length in Brussels and Washington really can change the direction either. Brian Beletic, in another brilliant video that he's just done about this, has again made the same point that's been made many times. You can give Ukraine infinite amounts of money. There's now growing talk in the West of basically if what Congress won't pass the $60 billion package, if the EU won't come up with this $50 billion package, then simply give them the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets that the West claims to have. Apparently, there's a position paper that's been provided to the G7 states, which supposedly, contrary to the overwhelming legal consensus, explains how this can be done in a legal way. I don't think anybody takes that seriously, but you will always find one lawyer or law professor somewhere who will always come up with a bad argument if you search hard enough. But maybe that's what they will do. But at the end of the day, these financial packages, this financial support can't substitute for the fact that the shells, the missiles, the tanks are not there in anything like sufficient numbers. And there isn't any wait time to train or mobilize enough Ukrainian troops to operate them, even if these shells and missiles and tanks and aircraft could be found. I'm going to just finish by making a particular point about drones. There's been a huge amount written about drones, about the fact that the Russians now are able to put 7 drones in the sky for every 1 drone that the Ukrainians have, about the fact that the Russians are far more successful jamming Ukrainian drones, the Ukrainians are jamming Russian drones. That Russian drones can operate higher, at higher altitudes than Ukrainian drones can do. The only advantage that the Ukrainians still have in terms of drone warfare is that apparently the mystery of how the Ukrainians were able to send signals to drones operating as far afield as Moscow has now been explained. They've been using the Starlink system, and it seems that the Russians, for the moment at least, don't have an equivalent, though perhaps before long they will have something, if not identical, then something in terms of space-based systems that will also enable them to increase further the range at which their drones can operate. But it seems again to me that when people talk about drones and drone warfare, they need to understand two things. Most Ukrainian drones, as I understand it, are now being handmade by workers in small workshops operated up and down Ukraine. It's a very busy, very active, enthusiastically supported handicraft activity. The Russians, by contrast, make drones industrially. They have factories that make them in vast volumes. They have trained workers, they have machine tools, they have infinite numbers of supplies that they can put together to make these drones. In any situation where one side is producing drones in a handicraft way, adapting commercial drones to that kind of purpose, and the other side is building drones industrially. It is the side that is building drones industrially that is always going to be at a decisive advantage. And that no doubt explains why there are so many more Russian drones than Ukrainian drones. And as time goes on, the gap is inevitably going to widen. But beyond the question of the number of drones, there is the question of drone operators. Now, this is undoubtedly a very skilled activity indeed. This is true in terms of the surveillance drones like the Orlan 10 that the Russians have, and the Bayraktar drone that the Ukrainians used to have and use. One hears less about them nowadays. But anyway, the Orlan 10, it's true in terms of the kamikaze drones like Lancet, and it's especially true, by the way, of the FPV drones, which have to be operated by particularly skilled drone operators. Russia apparently has established training schools for drone operators. They're trained over a year to perfect their skills and their understanding of how to operate their drones. This has been a process underway since the autumn of last year. One of the reasons why Russian drone activity has become so much more effective over the last few weeks is, again, precisely because these Russian drone operators who have been receiving training are now coming more and more onto the battle lines. They've been streamed into the battle lines. And of course, the training program has been continuing, and more of these drone operators on the Russian side are now joining the war. Whereas the Ukrainians, again, well, they do have some skilled operators, and they do try, no doubt, to train more. But obviously it is becoming more and more difficult for them. especially as one of the things that the Russians are doing is apparently they are specifically hunting drone operators. The Russians, with the much greater numbers of drones they have in the skies, are able to devote some drones, some kamikaze drones, specifically to targeting Ukrainian drone operators. Something which I suspect the Ukrainians cannot do. That is the fundamental difference. It is this colossal mismatch of resources which is growing all the time and every day. And President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny and the Western governments have no real answer or solution to any of this. And Gideon Rachman may once again conjure up South Korean variants. But it is far too late now to think about such things. Well, this is where my program today ends. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all of those great things. And if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.